Okay. Vermont history students, how are you? Welcome, and I'm so glad to have you here. And I thought maybe a glass of finest $3 bottle of wine might suit you. Come, pull up a chair. I will make you happy. Here, help yourself. Let's talk some Vermont history while you sip your wine. This is Unit 8 of the semester, and it gets us to the 2/3 of the way through the semester point. So we're really moving our way through. And one thing I totally want to emphasize, I really should have been emphasizing this all along, is that the course ends on July 1st, and on July 2nd, the next day, I'm going on a 5-week camping trip with my family. We're going out to Yellowstone and Montana and all that. It's going to be great. But I am not going to be around. If you have like a paper that is incomplete, I'll give you an incomplete if it comes to that, although I prefer not to. But if you don't get me all 3 of your assessment papers by Friday, July 1st, the incomplete's going to go on until late August or something. Get all your work done on time. Saturday, the day after the end of the semester, is 1 day too late. Are we clear about that? All right, cool. This is actually Monday, although I'll post this. It's for the part of the course, the unit that begins on Wednesday. And I just checked, and the town meeting replies are rolling in. And so I'm looking forward to responding to those after I make this movie, and I have some papers to grade. But first, Unit 8, I've actually cut it back because these outlines got ridiculously long last year, and I was just tinkering with it now, and I've cut it back to just 2 sections. One of them goes from where we left off, which is the election of 1902, up to World War I, and then the next one covers the 1920s up to the late 1920s. And the first unit is the first section of this unit is about the consequences of tourism still. And where we left off was that incredibly contentious 1902 election. And it was like a hurricane, that really struck Vermont, which is strange because in an overwhelmingly Republican state, Vermont politics had traditionally been quite placid and easily managed by the state elites, at least on the governor's level. Obviously the Senate, which is downhill controlled, and the House, which was uphill controlled, were at each other like cats and dogs. But the 1902 election, which everyone said, those people aren't real Vermonters, it was so contentious because of the backlash against downhillers sticking their noses into uphillers' business as required by reshaping the state to meet the demands of tourism. And one of the consequences, one of the things that made that 1902 election so contentious, was the reversal of Vermont's Maine law of prohibition. And Vermont had a referendum in 1903 to whether or not it wanted to keep the sale and manufacture of alcohol illegal or not. And what passed was called local option. And towns on town meeting day could vote whether they wanted to have prohibition or not on an individual town-to-town basis. And overwhelmingly the small towns kept it, and the big towns went towards selling alcohol. And downhillers got the totally wrong message about that. And so off you go on people fighting about whether it's a good idea to reshape the state for tourist needs. One good example of the confusion downhillers experienced, because remember, they used to think that backwardness was the worst thing about Vermont. Now it's the best thing about Vermont because you can use the backwardness and sell it in order to take the state forward, but hopefully not destroy the very thing you're trying to sell in the process. Was this magazine that lasted for 3 years called Expansion. Expansion magazine was a Burlington magazine, and it did fail, but in its short life it was full of all sorts of inconsistencies and contradictions. It was always talking about expansion, and we need to move Vermont forward, and this is a great day, and we want a greater Vermont, and we want a new Vermont. And that was, starting in about 1904, the phrase New Vermont was really popular across the state. Vermont was a new Vermont. It had woken up from its slumber. It was achieving a brighter future and a better present and all that. And the main cause of this enthusiasm was tourism. And what the tourists want is a backward state. And so Extension Magazine would always be talking about a greater Vermont and a new Vermont and about growth and development and more manufacturing and improving education and all this. And then like the next page it would be like, oh, and then come home to a tourist ideal and a restful place where you can fish and stay in fancy hotels and I mean, it's like the idea, at least, maybe is a perfect balance. Vermont can use the past in order to have development. It can use preservation in order to have development. It can use tradition in order to have progress. And it sounds great, but putting it into practice is much more complicated. An example of what I mean by this is a story I'll tell briefly about Rockingham, Vermont, and that's where Bellows Falls is. And right about the same time Expansion Magazine was folding in 1906, there was this guy named Lyman Simpson Hayes, who was actually a Brooklyn guy, manufacturer, who had a summer home in Rockingham and then retired there. And up on a hill in the old Rockingham village was a beautiful old townhouse, which had stopped being the town hall in the 1830s, and then had become a Methodist church, and then had been abandoned from the 1850s all the way for the next 50 years, all the way up until about 1906. And this dude who was retired, Lyman Hayes, decided out of the goodness of his heart that he was going to fix up this building. And so he's up there and he's pounding nails and he's painting it and fixing the pews and all of this. And all these tourists kept coming back and asking him if they could find their ancestors in the graveyard. And the graveyard, many of the gravestones were fallen over and some of them had been stacked up in a pile. And out of the goodness of his heart, Hayes decided the thing to do would be to take the gravestones and alphabetize them. And he did. He didn't move the bodies. He just alphabetized the gravestones. And so people could easily find... And this is a metaphor for what downhillers potentially could do. Are downhillers metaphorically going to alphabetize uphillers' graveyards? I mean, are they going to reshape it in a sort of fake way so that it appears to be what tourists want, but is actually a false image of it? Are downhillers going to actually deal with the fact that Vermont is not ideal, that it's not perfect? One example of downhillers grappling with this is the fact that an enormous percentage of Vermont's residents were people of French-Canadian ancestry. And this really comes to a head, I mean, facing this comes to a head in 1909, and that was the tercentenary, the 300th anniversary of Samuel de Champlain seeing Lake Champlain for the first time. And there was a big celebration about this. New York and Vermont combined to have these big celebrations. And one of the things they had to grapple with was the fact that Champlain was Catholic. He was French. The first person to see, European person to see Lake Champlain was a French Catholic. And so there was this guy, Oliver Beaupre, who was a Burlington pharmacist. He had a pharmacy right there on Church Street, who was asked to be on he was from Winooski originally, he was on the Tercentenary Commission, the committee of people who organized the festivities. And they had a Vermont Day, and they had priests who gave speeches and things like this, and it's really nice that way. Is it actually that Vermont, because Vermont is now being sold as this unspoiled perfect place, that it's going to be, downhillers going to actually grapple with the problems in an intelligent and democratic way? Well, one of the things was that after 1909, downhillers at least decided that the promotion of tourism, which was being done by the Board of Agriculture for the last 20 years, it was ridiculous that the Board of Ag was doing this. So they created a Bureau of Publicity. And if you look online in the folder for Unit 8, there's a couple of these Bureau of Publicity tourist pornography documents, The Lure of Vermont Silent Places, and there's another one, The Playground of the Continent. And there's all this discussion at the time, Vermont being sold, it's like a slogan, is unspoiled Vermont. Unspoiled. Vermont is unspoiled, which of course it isn't. I mean, it was 80% deforested. It's got child labor. It's got pockets of horrible poverty. The roads are terrible. The literacy rate, infant mortality rate, life expectancy, all these are the lowest in New England. And so what are they going to do in order to grapple with these problems? Well, both metaphorically but practically, the way I want you to think about it is you get to the 1920s, section 2 of this unit, and Vermont achieves really the pinnacle of its national prominence, of its identity as being this, unspoiled, pure place. America moved to the city, Vermont stayed in the country, and it reaches that pinnacle because the president was Calvin Coolidge, who had a homespun identity that was very popular in a decade when America was rushing forward, a decade of the growth of cinema and radio and mass circulation, newspapers and magazines and all these things. And Coolidge was a very comforting figure. And more people bought summer homes in Vermont because they wanted a piece of that old America. But the problem was there was lots of problems with that old America, with Vermont, and these were identified and researched by a guy named Henry Perkins, who was a zoology professor at UVM, who got very interested in the gene theory and in eugenics. And to make a long story short, he employed particularly women from the Vermont Children's Aid Society to go out and map out the state and find all these people's genealogies. And he acquired this big store of genealogies, and then decided that there was enormous pockets of degenerate people in the state, and that the solution to that was to sterilize them. Now, this is a big national movement. California is a big home of sterilization in the 1920s, 1930s. It was a popular thing. It was quite fascistic. The Nazis thought it was great. But Vermont, by 1930, had a sterilization law, and something like 500 to 1,000 people were sterilized over the course of the early 1930s into the late 1930s by this law. And it's a horrible thing, and you can read Kevin Dan's article about it in the folder and also read about it in the textbook. But to make a long story short, the question is this how downhillers are going to deal with the fact that Vermont is not unspoiled? Are they going to simply try to make the people who are problems, who don't fit the idealized image, disappear? Are they going to sterilize them and make them not exist? Or is the thing that they're eventually going to come around to doing trying to work collectively with uphill people in order to solve the problems that the state genuinely faces? And that's what I want you to think about. I mean, does the fact that downhillers are selling Vermont as an idealized rural place make them ultimately more or less sympathetic to uphillers? And that's the question I want you to deal with. So I hope you've enjoyed my time with me. I see you haven't had a chance to finish your wine yet. I hope that you I will get a to-go cup for you if you would like. And write me. Okay, that should do it.